Story number 1.
The woods had always been a place of peace for Hunter. His family had lived in the small cabin for generations, nestled on the edge of the forest, a place where the outside world couldn't touch them. As a child, he'd spent countless hours exploring the dense, towering trees, following the worn paths that led to hidden glades and bubbling brooks. He knew every inch of the land, or so he thought. But there was something different about this particular autumn. It had started with the disappearances. 3 people from the neighboring town had vanished over the past month. All of them had been experienced hikers or campers, familiar with the terrain. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, some blaming the weather, others hinting at something darker. The stories weren't new. For as long as Hunter could remember, the woods had been the subject of whispered rumors, stories of strange things that lurked just beyond the tree line, things that no one ever fully understood. Most people dismissed it as a superstition, but as the weeks passed, Hunter found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. He had grown up with his father telling him the same stories, warning him not to wander too far from the cabin at night, not to go near the old stone well hidden deep in the woods. His father was a practical man, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. But there was always a certain unease in his voice when he spoke of the forest, a look of concern in his eyes that Hunter never fully understood. Now, at 24, Hunter had returned to the cabin after years of living in the city. His mother had passed away a few years ago, and his father had been increasingly ill. Hunter had hoped that returning to the familiar place would bring some comfort, but the strange happenings in the woods had begun to gnaw at him. One afternoon, after hearing about the latest disappearance, Hunter decided he would venture deeper into the woods than he had ever gone before. He wasn't particularly concerned about the rumors. After all, he was a seasoned outdoorsman raised in these very woods. But as he packed his bag with water, food, and a map of the trails, a sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. His father had warned him again before he left, his voice hoarse and weak from illness. "Stay close to the cabin, Hunter. Don't wander too far. There's something you don't understand about those woods." Hunter had only nodded, brushing off the warning with a wave. But now, as he made his way along the familiar paths, his mind kept drifting back to his father's words. There was something in the air today, a heavy silence that seemed to suffocate the forest. The usual sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Hunter reached a fork in the trail where he had never gone before. The map indicated that it led to an old hunting lodge, long abandoned. His curiosity piqued. He decided to take the path. It was a steep climb, the trail barely visible beneath the overgrown brush, but he was determined to find the lodge. As he made his way deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and the silence became even more oppressive. His boots crunched loudly on the dry leaves, a stark contrast to the eerie stillness around him. The trees here were much older, their trunks thick with age, their branches tangled like skeletal arms reaching out to grab him. The path twisted and turned, as though it was trying to disorient him, leading him further away from the familiar world of the cabin and deeper into the unknown. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was as if the very trees themselves were observing him, their gnarled branches twisting and creaking in the windless air. Hunter paused for a moment, pulling out his water bottle and taking a sip, trying to shake the feeling of unease. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a dark figure standing between the trees. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure didn't move. It was too still, too unnatural. His first instinct was to turn and run, but something kept him rooted in place, his curiosity getting the better of him. He had heard the stories, but this wasn't a ghost or a spirit. This was real. The figure was tall, much taller than a man should be. It stood there motionless, a shadow among shadows, its features hidden by the darkness of the forest. As Hunter's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that it was no ordinary person. It was something else. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and almost translucent, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Hunter's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of creatures like this in the old stories, but he had always dismissed them as mere legends. Now, standing before him in the flesh was something that defied reason, something that should not exist. The figure took a slow step toward him, and Hunter's blood ran cold. The air around him seemed to warp and distort, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of this creature's presence. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his legs felt frozen, as if they were no longer under his control. Before he could react, the figure spoke, its voice like gravel scraping across stone. "You shouldn't be here, Hunter." The words were not a warning. They were a command. Hunter's mouth went dry, and he took an instinctive step back, his mind racing. How did it know his name? Who was this thing? The creature stepped closer, its long arms reaching out toward him, its fingers elongated and tipped with sharp, bone-like claws. Hunter stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest as panic set in. He spun around and ran, his legs finally responding, carrying him through the dense underbrush and into the deeper parts of the woods. He didn't look back, but he could feel it, whatever that thing was, pursuing him. Its footsteps were unnaturally silent, but Hunter could sense its presence closing in like a shadow at the edge of his vision. The trees seemed to shift as he ran, the trail he had once known turning into a maze of twisted branches and uneven ground. Every turn he took only seemed to lead him further away from the cabin, further into the heart of the forest. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the underbrush, his mind racing for a way out. The darkness seemed to close in on him, suffocating him, and the sounds of the forest grew more and more distorted. It was as if the very air itself was alive, pressing in on him, crushing him. And then just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, he saw it, the hunting lodge. It stood before him, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of trees, its broken windows like empty eyes staring out into the woods. Without thinking, Hunter charged toward it, pushing open the creaking door and slamming it shut behind him. Inside, the air was stale and musty, the walls covered in a thick layer of dust. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he stumbled through the dark, searching for a place to hide. He didn't know what he was hiding from, only that he needed to get away from whatever was chasing him. He found a small room at the back of the lodge and locked the door behind him. He pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving with each breath. The silence in the lodge was deafening. He listened for any sounds from the outside, but all he could hear was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. For hours he sat there, waiting, not daring to move. But the sounds of the forest outside had changed. The wind had picked up, and there was an eerie howling noise, like the cry of some unseen creature in the distance. Every so often he would hear something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the lodge. He knew it was the creature, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Hunter didn't know how long he sat there, trapped in the darkness, but as the night dragged on, he began to hear something else. Voices, low, murmuring voices that seemed to come from all around him. They were soft at first, like whispers in the wind, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come," one of them said. "It's too late," another voice added. Hunter's breath caught in his throat. He knew those voices. They were the ones who had vanished. Before he could react, the door to the small room creaked open. Hunter didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I was never one to believe in ghost stories. I grew up in rural Oregon, surrounded by forests, raised by a family of hunters and loggers. The woods were my backyard, my playground, my home. I knew them well. At least, I thought I did. That changed in October of 2017. I had taken a solo hunting trip deep into the Cascade Mountains, about 50 miles from the nearest town. I had planned to be out there for 5 days, just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. I wanted the isolation, the peace, and at first, it was exactly what I hoped for. The first 2 days were uneventful. I set up camp near a slow-moving stream, built a fire, and spent the daylight hours tracking deer. The nights were cold, but I was prepared for it. I had a sturdy tent, warm clothes, and the sounds of the forest to lull me to sleep. It was the third night when things started to feel wrong. I woke up sometime past midnight, heart pounding. I didn't know why. The fire was still glowing, the air was still, and there were no sounds, no owls, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then I heard it, a voice, faint, distant, almost drowned by the sound of my own breathing. At first, I thought I imagined it. I held my breath, straining my ears, and then, again, closer. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. A man's voice, low and hoarse. I sat up, reaching for my rifle. No one should have been out there. No one. I called out, "Hello?" Silence. Then the voice came again, but now I could hear it clearly. "Help me." A chill ran through me. It was coming from the trees just beyond my camp. I stood, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere without a light? Without gear? I swallowed hard and took a few steps toward the sound. "Who's there?" I called. Nothing. Nothing. A rustling. Branches snapping. Footsteps heavy and slow. My pulse pounded. The beam of my flashlight shook as I swept it across the tree line. Then, just for a second, I saw it. A figure. Tall, thin, standing just behind a tree. I could see part of its face, a sliver of pale skin, a single wide eye staring at me. Then it was gone. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My body screamed at me to run, to get in my tent and zip it up like a child hiding from a nightmare. But I didn't. Instead, I stood my ground, rifle raised. Then the voice came again, impossibly close now. "Help me." But something was wrong. It sounded wrong. The words were stretched, distorted, like someone trying to imitate human speech but failing. I didn't wait to find out more. I grabbed my gear, threw everything into my pack, and doused the fire. I left my tent behind. I just needed to get away. I had a GPS, but I didn't trust myself to fumble with it in the dark, not with something out there. So I followed the stream, knowing it would eventually lead me to the logging road where my truck was parked. I walked fast, then I walked faster. Then I heard footsteps, not mine. They were behind me, following. Keeping pace, I forced myself not to look back, just keep going. The voice came again, now right at my ear. "Help me." I ran harder than I ever had in my life, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. Branches slashed at my face, my arms, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I saw it. The glint of metal. My truck. I practically dove inside, locking the doors, my chest heaving, and then for the first time I turned to look back. Something was standing at the edge of the trees. Not a man. Not an animal. Something else. It was tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though it had no mouth, I swear I could hear it whisper, "Help me." I drove out of there so fast I nearly went off the road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where I pulled over and sat there shaking until the sun rose. I never went back. I never told anyone. But sometimes late at night, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. Help me.
Story number 3.
The day had been a strange one from the start. Craig had woken up late, his alarm clock long ignored, and with a vague sense of dread hanging over him. He couldn't explain why. It wasn't like he had anything pressing to do, no immediate deadlines or appointments. But something felt wrong, a gnawing unease that he couldn't shake. He brushed it off, chalking it up to stress. He lived in a small, quiet town, nestled on the edge of a vast national forest. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. Most people spent their days going about their business, work, school, the occasional evening out at the local bar. But the forest was different. It was big, ancient, and wild. Even though it was a place most of the locals loved to explore, there was always an underlying wariness about it. The town had its share of old tales, stories passed down through generations, some of them unsettling, others downright terrifying. Most people dismissed them as myth and superstition, but every once in a while something would happen, and the rumors would start again. Craig, however, had never been one to buy into local legends. He was an outdoorsman, someone who regularly hiked, camped, and spent time in the woods. The idea that something dangerous lurked among the trees was a laughable thought to him, and yet the unease that had clung to him all morning didn't seem so easy to ignore. By mid-afternoon, he decided to shake off the feeling by taking a walk in the forest. He grabbed his gear, a simple backpack, a water bottle, and a knife for safety, and headed out. The trail was well-worn and familiar. Craig had walked it dozens of times, and yet today the forest felt different. The trees seemed thicker, darker, as if they were closing in on him. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the usual rustling of birds and small animals was notably absent. It was the silence that unnerved him the most. He paused for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. Shaking his head, he pushed forward, blaming the eerie stillness on the overcast sky and the dense foliage blocking out much of the sun. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, the strange feeling only grew. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it was as if something was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing just out of sight in the shadows. But there was nothing. He continued walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of paranoia creeping over him. A few minutes later, he came to a clearing, a small open area where the trees thinned out enough to let the light through. He sat down on a fallen log to catch his breath. The quiet was almost oppressive, a heavy blanket of stillness that seemed to press down on him. Suddenly, there was a sound, a snap of a twig. Craig's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately turned his head in the direction of the noise. He didn't see anything at first, just trees and underbrush, but then he heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible movement in the brush, like someone or something was creeping closer. He stood up, instinctively reaching for his knife. His pulse quickened. His mind raced through possible explanations. It could be a deer or a bear, though he didn't like the idea of running into either alone in the woods. But the sound was too deliberate, too calculated. It wasn't the rustling of an animal. A cold sweat beaded on it. He took a few steps backward, his eyes scanning the trees for any movement. And that's when he saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing. Craig's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't make out any features. The figure was shrouded in the dark, its form indistinct against the backdrop of the trees. But he could feel its presence, like a weight pressing on his chest, suffocating him. "Who's there?" Craig called out, his voice rough, tinged with panic. His hand tightened around the knife's handle. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light of the clearing. Craig's heart pounded in his chest. The figure was tall, too tall, and the way it moved was unnatural, almost gliding rather than walking. Its clothes were ragged, torn in places, and its face remained hidden beneath a hood. Craig's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were frozen in place. The figure didn't make a sound as it approached, its footsteps eerily silent on the forest floor. "Who are you?" Craig asked again, his voice shaking now. He took a small step backward, still clutching the knife, but his mind raced. What could he do? He was out here alone, miles away from the nearest road. No one would hear him scream. The figure stopped a few feet away, just outside the clearing, standing in the shadows. Craig's eyes widened as he noticed something in its hand, a long, curved blade, its edge gleaming even in the dim light. The figure lifted the blade slowly, pointing it toward him. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice low and gravelly, as if it were struggling to speak. Craig's breath caught in his throat. The words didn't make sense. He had come here many times before. Why was this happening now? "What do you want?" Craig demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure knew something he didn't, that it was part of the forest, part of something older and more dangerous than he could ever imagine. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering him. Then it spoke again, the words heavy with a cold, unnatural finality. "Leave. Now." The warning hung in the air like a weight. Craig didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and bolted, adrenaline surging through his veins, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran as fast as he could, not daring to look back, the sound of his own footsteps pounding against the forest floor, drowning out everything else. But the woods seemed to shift, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against him. The path he'd taken earlier was gone, swallowed by the thickening underbrush. He couldn't see any landmarks, couldn't find any signs that he was headed in the right direction. Panic set in. The fear that had been a gnawing presence in the back of his mind was now a full-on, suffocating terror. Suddenly he stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the leaves. He fell forward, hitting the ground hard. For a moment, he lay there, gasping for air, his body shaking with the effort of running. He struggled to get up, his hands slick with sweat, his pulse racing. Then from behind him he heard the sound again, the soft, dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate. Story the end.